This filming is taking place in March of 2021, exactly 1 year after the lockdown for the coronavirus epidemic began. Since that time, Westfield has had about 2,500 recorded cases of the virus and 103 deaths. Nationwide, of course, there have been over 500,000 deaths, and worldwide there have been millions. The only comparable experience that Westfield ever had with anything like this was between October and December 1918, during the famous Spanish flu epidemic. During that 3-month period, Westfield had approximately 2,000 recorded cases, and between 150 and 200 deaths. Now, you have to keep in mind that Westfield's population was a little less than half of what it is today. So in other words, there were at least twice as many deaths in half the population. And those deaths, actually most of them took place in 1 month. The impact was enormous in this community. Nationally, in 1918, probably something like 600,000 people died during that same period. And that was in a population that was only 1/3 the size of the United States today. And the best guess is that worldwide, perhaps as many as 50 million people died that year. A horrendous loss. Probably the only comparable example was during the Black Death in the 14th century. It's strange that such a terrible epidemic and such an enormous impact upon the worldwide community has been largely forgotten. Probably the reason is that this was also the last year of World War I, the war to end all wars. Certainly all the European countries were deeply involved in it, and all of them practiced a severe form of censorship. No news stories were allowed that suggested that anything was going wrong with the armies or with the countries behind those armies. In the United States, laws were passed that made it illegal to even question the United States involvement in the war and anything that would bring down the morale of troops. It was illegal, and thousands of people went to jail. You've got to keep in mind also that there was no internet, there was no radio, there was no TV, there were no national newspapers. In fact, there was a limited national consciousness. Except for a fairly limited elite among political and economic and intellectual leaders, for the average American, there was little consciousness of the world beyond their small family and community circle. The impact was also very short. The great bulk of the deaths took place within 3 months. And it was horribly brutal. So brutal, in fact, that people wanted to wipe its experience from their memory. In addition, there was no medical understanding of what was going on. It was in a world where sickness and death were commonplace. For instance, 6 months earlier, a wave of measles had swept through the American Army camps, and 6,000 young American soldiers had died of measles. You've got to put that in a context of a world today where death by disease is rare and occasional and only after long periods of suffering and medical care. The medical remedies that were available were terribly limited. Germ theory itself was less than 50 years old. And the idea that there were things beyond germs called viruses was even less known than that. That was only 35 years old when people had discovered that there were such things as viruses. And keep in mind that the flu and all of the associated things like it are viruses. They're not bacteria, they're not germs. They can't be killed by germicides. By the way, that's something that the average citizen doesn't even seem to understand today. Lysol does not kill viruses because they're not alive. You have to put this in the context of the medical care that was available. In 1910, the Rockefeller Institute decided that it was going to reform American medical care, and it hired a man by the name of Flexer to prepare the Flexer Report on the state of medical knowledge. There were about 150,000 doctors in the United States at that time, and the report concluded that over half of them were incompetent, not just poorly prepared, incompetent. As late as 1910, there were over 150 U.S. medical schools. Only 19 required a high school diploma to enter, and only one, Johns Hopkins, required a college degree to enter. In fact, as late as 1885, Harvard granted MDs to people who failed 4 of the 9 courses required for an MD. Only 34 states offered any licensings for MDs. Thus, in 1917-1918, when the Spanish flu appeared, the average middle-aged MD was totally ill-equipped, maybe mentally ill-equipped, to deal with the disease. World War I made it worse. The United States entered the war in the summer of 1917. From that pool of 150,000 doctors in the United States, the Army scooped up 38,000 of the youngest and best trained. It also scooped up 1/3 of all the trained nurses in the United States. So the communities that were left behind and the medical personnel that were left behind were the worst of the worst. It wasn't that they were bad doctors. I mean, there are numerous fond memories of the dear old country doctors of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of them were very decent human beings. They just had no idea of modern science and whatever existed in modern medicine, except what remained of the so-called heroic medicine. In other words, they could bleed you, they could purge you, and they could sit by your bed and hold your hand. Palliative care was about all that was available. In Westfield, in 1918, there were 15 doctors. The city physician was Arthur Schumacher. He was an elderly homeopathic doctor. Now, what that meant is that he practiced a form of medicine that said that you were to be given minute doses of chemicals. And by that I mean perhaps a single drop in a vial of medicine, that if you had been given a large amount of that chemical, your body would emulate the conditions, the diseases. That is, if you had a fever, here was a chemical that would give you a raging fever if you had a large amount of it. And the theory was somehow that if you got a single drop of it, that would get rid of the fever. That was his training. He was the chief medical physician of the city. He was also in charge of all school doctors, school visits. He was in charge of the city's poor farm. And he was also one of 4 doctors on the board of the private hospital in town, the Noble Hospital. The other doctors in town weren't much better. We're talking about men in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and even 70s at that point in time. You can see how they had been trained. The Board of Health in town was composed of 3 men. The chairman of the board was Lewis B. Allen. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. He's the pure food man. His science medical background was 1 year at the Yale Science School. He had a reputation as being a specialist in the chemical natures of food. The 2 elderly doctors who shared the board with him were graduates of the Albany School of Medicine. There was a hospital. The Noble Hospital was at that point in time 30 years old. It was a 50-bed private hospital. There were 4 attending physicians. There were 3 trained nurse instructors. The staff was made up, the care staff was made up entirely of teenage student trainee nurses. Medical attention in the city was so bad that according to the city records, as late as 1918, apparently 1/3 of all births were not only unattended by medical care, but also were not registered with the city officials. They were only discovered when the school department made its own survey of the child population and discovered these births. Needless to say, the city was not prepared. How, where, and why the disease happened. Now, the best modern book on the great influenza epidemic is by John Barry. It's called The Great Influenza. He claims that the epidemic began in Kansas in January of 1918. Now, I say claims because the problem is we're dealing with a virus. Now, the flu viruses come in 3 forms, A, B, and C. The C form does not affect human beings. The B form does affect human beings, but it's not serious. It's sort of an annual occurrence, and you get minor ills, but no problem. The A form can be epidemic. Now, the host of the virus, that is where the virus exists all the time, is in birds. And the only way you can catch these flu coronaviruses under ordinary circumstances is if you live in a bird cage surrounded by birds, and then if you happen to catch it, you can't pass it on to another human being. It is a very, very rare thing. But the flu virus and its variations, and particularly the coronavirus that we have with us today, mutates like crazy. That means that every time it infects a cell and spreads from there, it produces thousands of mutations, thousands of variations. Now, most of those variations amount to nothing, and in fact means that that particular form of the virus dies out. It just extinguishes itself. And many more of those viruses in mutations mean that the virus becomes placid and harmless. But every once in a while, now we're talking thousands of times in every generation, every once in a while, one becomes highly contagious and dangerous, but not to humans yet, because the bird virus has to pass into a mammal. And then in a mammal, it has to go through mutations again before it can infect human beings. Barry says that the 1918 flu began with a swine flu epidemic. That is an epidemic among pigs in Kansas in 1918. And as evidence, he shows that shortly after this massive swine flu epidemic, there was a savage attack of flu in the Fort Riley military camp. Now, in 1917, the American Army was rapidly increasing. Fort Riley, Kansas was one of the centers for that army. And within the month of February, there were over 1,000 soldiers hospitalized with the flu in Fort Riley, Kansas. However, it was the normal flu. There were very few deaths. Those soldiers were then, after their training, shipped east to the ocean embarkation ports to be shipped overseas. And it was in this process of moving soldiers with the flu from the center of the country to the eastern seaboard that led to a second wave, the killer wave. Now, the only problem with this story is that newspapers began to report that in the summer of 1918, began to report that flu cases had popped up in Europe already. Now, it's in the Army that this happened. Keep in mind, there are millions of soldiers fighting already in Europe. And the U.S. Army, in the summer of 1917, goes from 400,000 soldiers to 16 months later, 5 million soldiers in brand new mass army camps. Fort Riley, for instance, had 60,000 soldiers crammed into a space that was set up for hundreds of soldiers. Now, this is what the hospital looked like in Fort Riley, Kansas. I think you can see that if anybody in this hospital situation had an infectious disease, that it would easily spread to everyone in sight. The camps were so overgrown, and the famous one in Massachusetts, that's the basis of our story, is Camp Devens, just outside of Boston. Devens went from nothing, no one was there, there was no camp in the spring of 1918, to 40,000 soldiers in a quickly run-up military camp by the fall of 1918. There, when people got sick, they had to erect tent hospitals, and this is a line of the tent hospitals at Devens. The first flu case in Devens was on September 1, 1918. By the 30th of September, there were 6,000 soldiers in the hospital. By mid-October, there were 15,000 soldiers hospitalized and over 1,000 dead. This happened in all the ports of embarkation. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were the worst. And perhaps Philadelphia is the worst hit city of all. That is the city that Barry focuses on. In Philadelphia, it got so bad that, like the Great Black Death of the 14th century, wagons patrolled the city calling for people to bring out their dead. And teams dug open pits in the city where bodies were not even put in coffins anymore, but were just laid down in the open pits. It was at this time, this second wave of deaths in the fall of 1918, that the horrors of the Spanish flu came out. People died within 24 to 48 hours of getting sick. Autopsies showed that the lungs were filled with a black coagulated mass of blood. The blood had hardened and thickened. People died of essentially the lungs turning solid. People died with blood flowing out of their noses, their ears, their eyes, and all body orifice. Black, thick blood. This was a disease that terrified the population. It was also different, not only in the length and the impact of the death, but for some strange reason, it killed the healthiest people. Now, ordinarily, flu kills people with immune systems that are weakened by age, or infants who have not developed a hardy immune system. This one killed particularly strong, healthy young men in their 20s and 30s. It made no sense. The strongest, the healthiest, the best attuned died the fastest. Now, in Westfield, most of this passed by with little notice. Now, we don't have a lot of information on what was going on in Westfield. I've looked at diaries that were kept by a few people that we have here in the library, and to be quite honest, there is very little mention of the flu. The only other source we have are the two newspapers that were in town. There was a daily, the Westfield Evening Journal, which was a multi-page newspaper with special sections on sports and women's and children's news. It covered some world news. World War I was going on, and that did have some attention, and an occasional regional or national news story, but usually those were limited to simply a paragraph or two long and on inside pages. The second newspaper was the Valley Echo. It was a weekly newspaper and not a very good one. It was essentially a tabloid that covered almost nothing but very local gossip and personal news. It did cover the hill towns, and you got a better coverage of the impact on citizens because it was much better at giving obituaries of people. Apparently, the daily paper restricted its obituaries to better known citizens. The Valley Echo seemed to produce obituaries of everybody, particularly Catholics. Now, that piece of the story is going to be important a little later on. During the spring and summer of 1918, there was very little notice of events outside of town. The newspaper covered the fight over prohibition in town, school committee battles. Women got the right to vote on the school committee for the first time, and there was a lot of discussion about how that changed the nature of the election and winners and losers. There was some discussion about the upcoming 250th anniversary of the community, which was going to take place the next summer. There were occasional reports from Dr. Gargas, who was head of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, about sickness in the Army camps, but the reports were always upbeat. Yes, there was sickness, but everybody was getting better and it was going away. There was nothing to pay any attention to hear, no matter what your son may have written you in a letter from the camp. In late May, the newspaper began the first reports of a mysterious epidemic in Spain. Now, this is where the word Spanish flu comes from. There were flu cases throughout the armies in Europe and in the countries of Europe. But all of the countries at war had severe censorship of news. Spain was not at war. So the Spanish newspapers reported on deaths among the soldiers and deaths among its own citizens. Therefore, Spain reported it had flu. Therefore, this sickness became the Spanish flu. No, it probably didn't begin in Spain, and no, Spain is probably not necessarily the cause of it, but it has been the Spanish flu ever thereafter. But these were minor reports in the Westfield newspaper, and there was little coverage again until in mid-July, when in the interior pages of the Westfield newspaper there were a couple of filler articles that this influenza epidemic was threatened to spread to the world. There was one story about the impact of the flu in Iceland, for all places. In September, the newspaper took notice of the world around it in a very strange way. It began to report an outbreak of chicken flu and chicken deaths. Some 65 families in Westfield reported hundreds of chickens dying from a strange disease. At the same time, on interior pages, the newspaper began to have small filler reports on the first deaths of flu at Devon's and Boston. There was some editorial speculation that the disease was being spread by German submarines, and that's why most of these deaths were being reported from ports. No one put together the fact that there were these soldiers leaving from ports in great numbers. Perhaps that spread disease. But this was a German plot, and probably it would go away. Late in September, the newspaper said that most people in Westfield were still treating influenza as a joke, and that's the word they used, a joke. On the 21st of September, the Westfield Board of Health released an official report and said there was no cause for concern. Influenza was nothing more than the normal fall la grippe. I remember when I was young, people were still calling flu the grippe. On September 26th, after a directive from the government in Boston, the Westfield Board of Health ordered that all schools, churches, theaters would be closed immediately and there'd be no public funerals. An editorial the same day announced that there was no cause for alarm, that this was simply a precautionary measure from the state, and that anyway, cold weather was coming and cold weather would certainly wipe out this illness. That same newspaper edition also reported the first 2 deaths from the flu, one of whom was a Mrs. McCall, and announced that a couple of the doctors in town were themselves sick. On September 30th, there was a front-page newspaper article that there was opposition from the churches to the order to close, and that in fact most of the pastors did not see any reason for it. On October 3rd, there was a notice that the first nurse in town had died, and that she had cared for Mrs. McCall, whose death 5 days earlier had been announced. On October 5th, the Protestant clergy in town had gotten together and they agreed that they would shut down their services. Now, this is a week after both the state and the town officials had ordered the churches to close. Finally, the Protestant clergy agreed. The Catholic clergy did not. They were waiting for instructions from the diocese in Springfield. October 7th, there was a second order from the Board of Health that saloons had to shut down. Now, they were supposed to have been closed a week earlier, but many people thought that alcohol was a medicine. It was commonly given for medicinal purposes, and even the saloons that had officially shut their front doors had kept their back doors open so patrons could come in. On that same day, there was an article that nurses at the hospital were ill, and that the 50 beds of the hospital were filled and more beds had been set up in the halls, that there was a daily caseload of 60 to 90 patients in a hospital designed for 50. On October 14th, 3 weeks after the initial order, the Board of Health announces that all churches are ordered closed, that no Catholic services may be held, and that the National Guard had been ordered into the streets of Westfield. 64 men from the 15th Regiment, armed, were to patrol the streets to enforce mask regulations. This is the first time there was an announcement that everyone was required to wear a mask. All people, when on the streets of Westfield or in public, were to be masked, and the Guard was to enforce it. The Guard was also to patrol the streets of the city, to provide any assistance that could be called for. The same October 14th newspaper story asked for volunteer nurses, particularly from the girls' clubs. I have no idea what they thought teenage girls from the girls' club were going to do to save people's lives. But keep in mind, medical care meant palliative care. It meant keeping you clean and warm and bringing you food and holding your hand. Probably teenage girls could do it as well as anyone else. Interestingly, there was a special notation that they wanted women over the age of 40 because it said that it seemed that they were immune to this disease. The hospital was so full that the YMCA, which had an office and a building on School Street, that the YMCA had set up beds in parts of its room, and that would take the hospital overflow. The soup kitchen was set up in the YMCA building, staffed by volunteers from community service organizations, and that was providing food to 100 families in town. Some of the views in the Westfield newspaper give you an idea of the impact. A story that had not been covered 2 weeks earlier suddenly had scare headlines and ads like this. Or, now that may look strange to you, but this is a world where one of the great public health nuisances was people spitting in the streets. The problem was made worse by the essential ethnic paranoia in town. Now, in the previous 20 years, the Westfield population had increased 50%. That 50% increase was immigrants. Immigrants from the town records show two sources primarily, Russia and Austria. Now, these were empires in 1918. We know the people in the present Westfield population as Poles, Lithuanians, and Slovaks. There also had been a large immigration of Italians. Now, these were alien populations in Westfield, and on October 16th, an editorial in the Westfield newspaper announced that most citizens in Westfield had nothing to fear from this disease, that mostly it infected foreigners. And it was obvious why. Quote, "They have not the same standards of living and cleanliness as native-born Americans," unquote. Now, this is a phenomena that is mirrored in the coronavirus today. The reality is that the great bulk of the diseases and deaths was in fact among that foreign-born population. Just as the reality of the 2020 coronavirus is that a very large percentage of the deaths is among the Black, Hispanic, and immigrant elderly populations. Those populations tend to live in crowded circumstances in cities. That's where the deaths are, is in cities. It tends to be spread from person to person living close together. And the deaths spread. By the way, that's where the National Guard patrolled. It did not patrol all of Westfield. The National Guard was assigned to very specific districts. The districts inhabited by the foreign-born in Westfield. These were Meadow Street and the side streets off it, Orange Street and the little streets around it, Mechanic Street, and the areas around the whip factories on Elm and Franklin Street. Those were the factory areas. Those were the areas of the factory employee housing areas. The employees at those entry-level jobs were immigrants. That was the immigrant housing. Those were the areas patrolled by the armed guard. The schools were closed. School lessons were printed in the newspapers. The newspaper editorialized in late October that was probably a good thing. School closing was good for the students because being out in the fresh air was good for them, and being closed up in the schools probably would spread the disease. On October 27th, under pressure, the churches were reopened, and on the 28th, the saloons were reopened. Schools, the library, and theaters would remain closed till October 11th, and the guard would stay patrolling the streets until that time. The guard patrolled in Westfield for a little over a month. But the saloons and the churches were open, and people went about their way. Stories about the flu and the flu death disappeared in early November. Essentially, it was only late the last week in September and the month of October that there was any real coverage of this flu. There were occasional notices that there was illness still around town, but it was over as an event in the public consciousness of the people of Westfield. During the fall of 1918, probably there were at least 150 dead, maybe as many as 200. Over half were aged 20 to 34. It was the young again. There were 1,700 reported flu cases between October 4th and December 30th. Now I say reported because it was not until October 4th that flu was required to be reported. Any cases that existed before that time, there was no record kept. When it was all over with, there were 32 widows with 114 dependent children placed on the poor list in Westfield. Now you've got to keep in mind, there is no public welfare, there is no Social Security, there are no social services, there's none of the support system that we have in our world. If you are a widow with infant children, you are thrown on the mercies of the public. The average age of those widows was 29. There were also 80 children orphaned. Both parents, all relatives, dead. And they were thrown upon the mercies of the town. And in fact, for some days, there was a good deal of debate in the newspaper about the horrendous financial burden this had put upon the town. It was estimated it would cost $10,000 to $15,000 per year to support these orphans. About 500 people had been hospitalized during that 3 months. Now, I can tell from the newspaper reports and from the medical department reports that flu still killed in January and February of 1919, but at a very much lower level and totally out of the consciousness of people. The war ended in November, and that took up all the headlines and all the public consciousness. That and homecoming celebrations, the fall disaster was quickly forgotten. But the flu remained. In fact, we now know that there had been a previous horrendous flu epidemic. There was the Russian flu epidemic of 1889. In fact, some people think that that may be the reason why elderly people didn't really get affected by this flu of 1918. They may have had a certain immunity to it. There was the Spanish flu of 1918, and then in 1928, this Spanish flu came back, and it killed tens of thousands of people in the United States. But it totally disappeared in the news stories of the Roaring '20s. You know, you've got Prohibition and gangsterism and the Jazz Age and Boom America, and we've paid no attention to it. Flu recurred year after year after year. In 1957, only those of us of my age remember that, the U.S. deaths from flu topped 300,000. It's one of the reasons when this coronavirus outbreak took place a year ago, some of the government leaders said, well, you know, we've been through this before. They looked back to the 57 case. 1968, there was the Hong Kong flu that killed tens of thousands in the United States. 1997, the avian flu. 2003, SARS. 2009, swine flu. Even with annual flu shots, even with modern medical care, the flu kills tens of thousands of Americans every year. The flu, and probably the coronavirus, will be with us for a long, long, long time. Hopefully, we will not forget this one as quickly as we forgot the great Spanish epidemic of 1918.